The state of Florida purchased Ichetucknee Springs and a portion of the river in 1970, and I was the chief naturalist of the Florida State Park system at that time. So my first visit to Ichetucknee was an official visit to get the lay of the land, to see the springs, to consider how we should manage and protect and restore it. And it was a very impressive natural area, but unfortunately it had been seriously abused by the public. So we set about trying to clean it up. There was trash everywhere where people would empty it out of their garbage cans. And we've had a very small staff of a park manager and a couple rangers. And so their daily duty was to pick up trash. And at that time, in fact, through most of the 1960s, there was extremely heavy use by tubers, primarily students from the University of Florida. And their practice was to have inner tubes with styrofoam coolers pushed into them with many, many cans of beer to consume on their way down the river. And of course, they rarely ever took out what they brought in. So the bottom of the spring run and river was just lined with beer cans. And so that was quite a task, cleaning those up too. And for many, many years after, those beer cans were still showing up as the current shifted away from sediments. So we tried to educate these folks to keep the river clean, and we warned them that if they didn't, we would start cutting back on public use. And they did not stop trash in the river, so we did start cutting back on public use. In fact, in 1974, we forbade any drinks or food on the river. And so that really helped in cleaning it up. It was open to any kind of use. It was owned by Longcalla Phosphate Company, and they tried to keep people off the property except at the head spring. They did permit access there. Now, some previous manager, we don't know if it was Longcalla or who, tried to plug up the head spring, we're told with dynamite and we're told with a bulldozer to stop the flow. And they figured if they could stop the flow, that would stop the swimming. And so the spring vent at the head spring was almost plugged up. And it was 12 feet in depth, which is pretty shallow, when we set about to restore the head spring by removing pieces of concrete and 5-gallon cans of sand. And so practically every Saturday for a period of time, the rangers and volunteers would get out there and start uncovering the spring vent. And it went over time from 12 feet in depth to 30 feet in depth. And when it was 12 feet, there was hardly any boil or any swirl in the water coming up. But as we deepened it, it had quite a nice boil and was much bluer than it had been in the past. So it was one of the success stories. The ranger that took the lead on it was Ranger Rick Hughes, and we gave him the Springs Restoration Award at the Springs Conference for his accomplishments. The public use impacted the shoreline primarily through erosion from trampling of thousands and thousands of feet, trampling the bottom. So the aquatic vegetation was stripped out of the head spring and stripped out of much of the upper river. So we had to put a stop to that, which was quite a struggle. Thomas Jefferson said, "Do not attempt more good than the public can bear." And so we had to pace ourselves. Instead of just stopping things automatically, we had to phase them in to avoid public backlash. When I first saw the strength of the head springs, it was diminished. I mean, the water was clear and blue, and you could see a little bit of movement in it, but because of the debris that had been thrown into the spring vent, it was not very impressive. But over time, there was a boil where the water surface would be maybe 2 inches higher than the surrounding surface, and you couldn't swim across it. It was so strong. So the loss of aquatic vegetation, the erosion from trampling, the littering were all issues that we had to deal with. And the construction that occurred there then was to stabilize the shoreline with native stone. And much of that native stone, the walls can be seen there today. Unfortunately, the Park Service has changed somewhat since those days in the 70s and 80s, in that now there's not the sensitivity, aesthetic sensitivity, for scenic values such as using native materials, native timbers and native rocks, lime rocks. Today you can look at some recent improvement, shall I say, and it's mostly concrete and aluminum railings, which is very disappointing to me since we worked so hard to have it aesthetically pleasing in the early days. The greatest threat, and the threat that's hardest to get a handle on, hardest to deal with, is the nitrates that are coming into the system from as far north as Lake City. Virtually the entire basin that feeds the water to the aquifer and to the Ichetucknee is in Columbia County. And so we have to be able to influence the elected officials and appointed officials in Lake City and Columbia County to have them do a better job of controlling pollutants, primarily nitrates. A second priority is what we've been talking about thus far, and that's the trampling of the aquatic vegetation. And then along with the crowds, we don't have as much wildlife. There's some consideration being given right now to stopping tubing on the upper portion of the river, and I'm certain we're going to see an increase in wildlife. Otter, beaver, wood duck, limpkins, many other spring run species will feel safe being here now without the crowds. Yeah, there's a saying that you don't save a park once. There was a time when we thought all we had to do to save a spring was to buy it. And the state of Florida has bought 16 major springs thus far, the first being Manatee Spring near Chiefland in 1949, and of course Ichetucknee in 1970. But we've learned that just buying the spring, it'll protect the hole where the water comes out, but it doesn't protect the water. So if we don't deal with the folks up in Lake City and parts of Columbia County and get them to take action to reduce nitrates, we will eventually lose the Ichetucknee, just as we're going to lose every other spring in Florida. So it's a major challenge. I don't know if we'll succeed or not. It's worth the effort, but these are tough problems. Well, education is the most important strategy for protecting a spring. If people don't know that it's threatened and don't know how to protect it, then nothing's going to happen. So we put great emphasis on education here to get the public behind us. And the most important public is the residents of this county and of Lake City, because they're the ones that are flushing the toilet and fertilizing the lawns and putting nitrates out for other purposes such as cows and dogs and so on. Yeah, you always feel emboldened when you have other people standing with you. So I'm in favor of meetings as long as they lead to something in the way of action. I used to tell the folks in the working groups that we had the Ichetucknee Springs Basin Working Group, and I would tell them, this is not a meeting group, this is a working group. And you need to leave here at the end of this meeting with something to do to protect the Ichetucknee. But the most important public, as I mentioned, is the local residents. And many of those were past county commissioners. Many of them are relatives of county commissioners. And this is a population here that has been very stable over the decades. And so I've focused my work on trying to educate the locals. We had Old Timers Days, which were a great success, where anybody that knew the Ichetucknee in 1970, when it was first purchased, was an official Ichetucknee old timer. So one day a year, we would have them bring a covered dish, and we'd have the picnic tables at the head spring just covered with great foods, and there would be storytelling. They'd all tell about what it was like when they were kids and describe a more pristine place. And this was their place of social gathering. I mean, this was rural North Florida, and there wasn't much to do as far as social activities. So going to Ichetucknee was what they did. And some of them got here by mule, some by horse and wagon, some of them walked, some of them took the nearby train and then walked from the train tracks over. But coming to Ichetucknee was a really big deal for folks back in the earlier days. Now that changed in the 1960s. They went from having family reunions and school outings and just places to play to being shoved out, literally, in their words, by the outsiders. And the outsiders were the folks from Gainesville, and primarily the students. So the locals just quit coming, and therefore quit caring as much about the welfare of the Ichetucknee. So I set about trying to reverse that, to get those folks to care as they did in the past. A man by the name of John Wheeler, he's an insurance man in Lake City and very active with the Rotary Club. He set up Baptism Sundays, which occurred once a year in October, and they were very popular. As many as 7 churches would bring their folks to the head spring on a Baptism Sunday and wade right out into the water, and it was total submersion, and it was so emotional that one would have tears in their eyes seeing folks do that. It really brought back the old days. I'm hopeful that as we shift the use from the head spring down to the south end of the park, that those family reunions and church socials and school picnics and all will be activated again at the head spring. Yeah, well, people have been hanging out here for thousands of years. A portion of the Timucuan Indian tribe had a large village right on the other side of the river. And it was there when DeSoto came through in 1539. So they had a good life, a good place to live and clean water to drink and bathe in, and were here until the Spanish diseases and slavery and that type of thing diminished the population. So this became Spanish Florida, and there was a series of missions across North Florida from St. Augustine to the Chattahoochee River. And the Indian trails that went in that direction became the El Camino Real, which was interpreted to be the King's Highway during Spanish Florida. So it came right up to the head spring and curled around the head spring and went on to the west to Charles Spring on the Swanee River and another mission site. So there was a mission here on the Ichetucknee, just very close to where we're at right now. And it was in existence in 1608. And so that's an interesting period of our history as well. And so after Spain turned over Florida to the U.S., Congress appropriated $20,000 for the first federal road across North Florida. And that became known as the Bellamy Road, and that's the road that came right up around the head spring. So where you park today at the north end, the parking lot is the Bellamy Road, or the El Camino Real. So that's a very historic spot. When the state purchased Ichetucknee, we didn't want a through road, County Road 238, Bellamy Road, coming right through the park, so we relocated the road north of the park. So what you park in today is the old historic road, which is the parking lot. Well, and then the population shifted again. Of course, the Indians were gone, the Spaniards were gone, and white settlers moved in. They're the ones that first started enjoying the spring, well, not first started enjoying the spring, but of the early residents. And they did what I mentioned earlier, was having church picnics and school socials and family reunions, and this was their social gathering place right here at the Ichetucknee Head Spring, and also at Mill Pond Spring further down the river, where there was a general store and a blacksmith shop and other facilities like that. Oh, a post office. I think the post office went in 1878. So just a rich history. I mean, you have this wonderful natural values, but then you've got an equally important cultural values to talk about. So the local rural residents in the area that could get here by horse and wagon or by mule or on foot kind of owned the place. It was their spring. And when Gainesville discovered Ichetucknee, that shifted. The crowds and the litter and the noise, and the locals just lost interest in it. It wasn't a fun place for them to be, and they quit coming. And so just before the Park Service took over, this place was run pretty much by the crowds of tubers. Then the Park Service moved in with typical regulations in order to protect the natural resources, and put a fee on it, not an expensive fee, but a fee to help pay for some of the improvements. And so that brought in another population. So there's been an evolution all the way from the Aborigine Indians, the Timucuans, right up to present day, where we've got the park, the resource pretty tightly restricted to protect it from abuse. People started buying the properties. I understand that you could buy an acre for $400 back in the 50s. And the subdivision went in prior to the Park Service coming along. So that it's usually a matter of what's available, and can the state afford it, and how's the appraisal look. Those factors are put in. We've always tried not to buy facilities, not to buy residences or facilities like that, unless the residence would be needed for a park ranger residence in order to have park people on site. But it varies with how you determine what is purchased. There is some land south of US 27 along the river that the park owns, but is not used by the public at this time. Well, the baseline syndrome that you mentioned earlier is quite remarkable. It's a term that I had not heard until just a few years ago, but it's where when you see something for the first time, you kind of lock into that as your first impression. When we have folks come and people come from all over the world to see North Florida Springs, but when they see that clear blue water boiling up from underground, that's a lasting impression. They never forget that. But they can come back in 10 or 20 or 30 years and it very likely won't look the same. It won't look as nicely because, again, we have that first impression of what it's like. So whereas we can see garfish and mullet in the river now, in 10 years we might not see them. We've had one opposite thing happen. In 2002, we had the first sighting of manatees. Prior to that, manatees weren't known to be in the river. They may have been here in the past, way back, but in our time they had not showed up until 2002. So that's been a nice attribute to talk about. Reduced flow can impact many values, and impacting the aquatic wildlife is certainly one of them. The MFL, minimum flows and levels, are the state's attempt to protect these flows for all times, but it's not working. We don't, our heart isn't in it. And until that attitude changes, we're going to continue to lose flow in the Ichetucknee and other such places. It's one thing to pass a regulation, it's another thing to enforce it. In 1999, there was a threat of a major cement factory being constructed on the Ichetucknee. And enough people had enjoyed the Ichetucknee and cared about the Ichetucknee that there was a huge uproar. Virtually every major newspaper in the state of Florida, including the Miami Herald and Tampa Tribune, wrote editorials about this happening and how the Ichetucknee needed to be saved. So the public got behind it. There was a walk from the cement plant site to the Ichetucknee, a march, if you will. There was a demonstration at the Department of Environmental Protection's headquarters in Tallahassee. And there was such an uproar that newly elected Jeb Bush decided he needed to see the Ichetucknee. He had never seen it. I don't know that he had ever seen a Florida spring. And he brought his brand new Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection with him. Neither of them had been here before, so I was asked to lead them on a canoe trip of the Ichetucknee and interpret it for them, which I was glad to do, because getting that kind of high level of attention on a problem was quite a feat. So by the time we got to Devil's Eye Spring, I had convinced the secretary that something needed to be done, and he told me to put together a Florida Springs task force to determine how we should protect the Ichetucknee and other Florida springs, which I gladly did. We put together a 16-member task force of people that were knowledgeable about springs. In 1 year, we produced a report with 12 strategies that we had to implement. That report was taken by the governor's office, and they put in for $2.5 million to protect Florida Springs. That was the first ever money to protect a Florida spring, $2.5 million. So one of the projects that was really important and a high priority on our project list was a film of Florida Springs. And it was called Water's Journey, Hidden Rivers, and it was very well done by Wes Skiles. So anyway, we set about funding projects and started making headway, getting a lot of publicity. So it shows what can be done if enough people appreciate a natural resource. So that outcry, it turns out the cement plant is 4 miles away and not on the Ichetucknee as was thought it was going to be. But nevertheless, it was a real accomplishment to get the governor and the Secretary of DEP here. Well, we formed a working group. The first one was Wakulla Springs, south of Tallahassee, the Wakulla Springs Basin Working Group, made up of stakeholders that cared about Wakulla Springs, whether with agencies or just citizens. And the second working group in the state was right here at Ichetucknee. And there were 7 working groups total by 2010 when Governor Scott cut all of the Springs funding and cut staff, and that pretty much ended our Springs Protection Program until the next governor came in. I think the funding has increased, but the target for spending has changed. One of the main problems that's affecting our springs is human waste, and that means septic tanks and sewage treatment plants. So all of those, we need to get rid of most septic tanks, not all, but most. We need to upgrade sewage treatment plants like in Lake City. And so those are high priorities, but very expensive priorities. Agriculture is a real issue in many spring basins. Like here in southern Columbia County, there's a good bit of ag that needs to reduce their nutrients. So it's a massive problem, but the springs are worth it. I'll just tell you something that's it's an interesting story. One of the educational activities that we put on was getting all the 5th graders from the 2 elementary schools in Columbia County, brought them together at Rose Sink, which is 7 miles north and is connected by a cave to the springs here. So we bused the kids to Rose Sink, and we had a cave diver and his equipment here for one station. Another station was a DEP stormwater specialist. Another station was the park biologist. Another station was biologists talking about aquatic invertebrates. And every 20 minutes the kids would switch so that everybody got to hear every station. And they were just fascinated. I mean, no kidding around or running around or laughing or giggling or none of that. They were glued to that instructor. And that was really great to see them take to it as well as they did. And you know how a teacher will have the kids write a thank you note to the host. And so I got this big stack of letters, and one little girl said, she says, my dad was gonna fertilize the lawn after supper, but he decided not to fertilize the lawn. She had told him about her day and about fertilizer, so that was a plus. She took that message home. One little boy says, when I get cows, I'm gonna keep them out of the creek. Good for him. Another little boy said, why didn't you do something about this a long time ago? Pretty bright kid. And another little girl says, dear Mr. Stevenson, I hope you live for a few more years to teach others about Ichetucknee Springs. So kids say the darndest things.